Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this January 8, 2015 edition of Nightcast. We got a lot of stories for you tonight, friends, including opening story about the firefighters tackling large bushfires near Adelaide. We'll tell you about that in a moment. We've also got news related to weather. United States having dangerously low temperatures and snow. And there's snow in Syria, and the Syrian refugees are finding great pleasure flipping around in the snow as if just it provides a refreshing relief from them having had to leave their homes in middle of civil war. And we'll have that story coming up. And then, of course, we'll have tonight the news related to the big news related to what's going on in France and around Europe with what happened yesterday with the shooting, a killing of 12 persons. And we'll talk about some analysis related to that, too. But first, let's go to the story related to the Bible talking about heat and heat waves during the last days of man on this earth before Jesus Christ returns. And in this opening story, firefighters are tackling large bushfires near Adelaide. And they've said they're growing more confident they can contain them. You know, and friends, that's probably because God is giving them a little break. He lets things happen enough to give us a scare and a warning that, listen, something very serious is going on here. And it should wake people up to look at Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, where God says, if you obey me, you've got these wonderful blessings. I'll bless you with abundance of rain in due season, and enough rain where your forest won't catch on fire. And you'll have the fruit of your fruit trees this way. But if you don't obey me, and he says many more kinds of blessings, I've mentioned them numerous times on this program, but I'll just make mention of where you can look them up in the two blessing and cursing chapters, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28. And in both of those chapters, after telling you all the wonderful blessings God will give you, both as individuals and collectively within your nation, if you diligently hearken to his voice and obey his commands, his statutes, his judgments, and his voice. On the other hand, he goes on after enumerating all the blessings and says, on the other hand, if you don't diligently hearken, if you don't obey the voice of your eternal and of the eternal, your heavenly Father, and obey his commands and statutes and judgments, he enumerates the curses, which in most cases are just the opposite, the blessings turned on their head in reverse. And then multiplied 7 times, and then to the extent that you as a nation will find yourself with the pride of your power busted if you continue to disobey your Creator, as many people in the modern-day nations of the sons of Israel are doing today. Now, I'll just make that little mention at the outset, and then let's go on with this story and others. We've got a lot of news stories tonight. I just wanted to give you just a little key to why some things happen, why some things are blessing, why they're not. And yesterday, let me just mention this up front, because I want you to, those of you that have an interest in this, I want you to be sure and be mentally sharpened and anticipating and looking forward to some things we're going to say about yesterday having been the 81st anniversary of the beginning of the World Tomorrow broadcast by Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong on January 7, 1934, and the significance of the fact that that broadcast began 81 years ago yesterday, and 81, interestingly, being a multiple of 9. 9 times 9 is 81. There's some significance to that. We'll talk about the things that relate to what happened. 3 important things that happened yesterday, on yesterday's date, on the 81st anniversary since the beginning of the World Tomorrow program. And even though the initiator of that program is no longer alive, and of course neither are Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all of the apostles, the early apostles, all of the prophets. Jesus Christ himself died. He's the only one of them who is resurrected and alive today, being right at the right hand of the throne of God the Father and acting as our intercessor for those of us who know and understand that and who pray to the Father in the name of, in the authority of Jesus Christ. We're able to come to the Father because of his redeeming sacrifice. And Jesus Christ is alive and acts as if he were our attorney for us, our lawyer, our intercessor, making plea to the Father. Hey, look, the guy's asking, Father, in my name for a break, for forgiveness for his sins. I paid the price for those sins. He wants help from us. Let's pardon him and give him the help. Just like the father that came to Christ and asked that his son be healed, and Christ said, as you believe, it'll be done to your son. And man, realizing that, well, wait a minute, I may come up on the short end of that because my belief is kind of blindsided by what Satan has done to me all my life, and I've got something the world has. I've got some unbelief, and the Father wisely and with much love for his son said to Jesus Christ, if that's the way you're going to do it according to how I believe, then help my unbelief. And with the wisdom that the man showed by asking that and just pouring out his heart without vanity, just and acknowledging, I may come up short on that, Christ. My belief may be a little weak. And Christ helped his unbelief, and the man's son was healed that very hour. And I would dare say the man's faith, the man's unbelief came up several notches after that. I think when Christ did help his unbelief as he healed his son for him, in spite of the fact that his belief was a shade short. So we can ask. He's merciful is what I'm trying to say. He's very merciful. And so God have mercy on me getting this program going tonight without overdoing the introduction before I usually get to some talk. This is a news program, but it's also a news program related to the Bible and prophecy. So, friends, we're going to bring the Bible into it. If you tune in here for news, you're also going to get your ears full of how the news relates to the Bible. And what I'm trying to also say is just this. I do want to say this in the beginning, that even though Mr. Armstrong has died, his programs are still available. They're recorded. They're all over the place on the internet. We've got a link on our website from our... You go on our homepage and look at the library tab up above. If you're watching from our homepage, if you're not, you got to go over to cogtv.org, and then you'll see some menus tabs across the top. One of them is library, and on that menu tab there is a link that takes you to a site. It's somebody else's site who's got thousands of articles and the booklets and publications that Mr. Armstrong published from headquarters where I worked for many, many decades. And I worked as an instructor at Ambassador College for the continuing education at Imperial Schools. I did other things there too. Worked in the television studio while I was a student, and for 2 years. And it started one department there that because of things in the contract that I worked in television before I came to college, and I knew something that was in all contracts when you buy time, and the work wasn't taking advantage of it. And so when I told Mr. Norman Smith, the director of television, hey, how come we're not doing those 30-second promos that they give us 52 a week? Not exactly free. It's part of the contract. They give us 50. They're supposed to show 52 times during the week. They're supposed to show 30-second promos for our program. We're paying for that actually in the contract, but we have to provide the 30-second promo. And beside that, they'll do 104 10-second slides plus 52 30-second video promos. And Mr. Smith said, "Is that right, Stephen?" I said, well, check the contracts and see. So he went to the people that write the contracts, and he went to Mr. Armstrong, too, and said, hey, this is supposed to be in our contracts. When they said, well, let's look at the contracts. They did, and sure enough, they said, well, that's in there. We never really paid attention to that before, noticed that, till this crazy student who worked in television in Miami, Florida before brings it up to us. And I got to help work on the Jackie Gleason show at a station that I was working at, and I got to do a lot of neat things in big television outlets before coming to college. But anyway, that caused them to open up a promotion department. I was put in charge of it, and I had to work with the artist who did made up the 10-second slides, and work with the people that wrote the copy and did the video, and then worked with the people that dubbed it off and who made the slides and put them in the little metal containers, which I had to help do, and then put them in the packages and mail all that stuff out each week to all the stations, some 165 or so at the time. And that was a big job, big job. And they finally hired me a full-time boss. They hired 2 other people to work that thing to cover me while I would go off for the summer. And it took 3 people to do what I was doing for 9 months. One of them full-time. That was funny to me. And anyway, I came back and worked it another year, and then went to summer camp again, and then came back and taught at Imperial Schools after that. I was asked to teach a dance program that we'd done up at summer camp, ballroom dancing. Anyway, boy, am I getting along, and we hadn't gotten into the news yet tonight. There's big news tonight, friends. We'll get there in just a moment. I wanted to make this point, though, because I sometimes you feel like you need to explain something to those who just watch. There are some of you who contact me and talk to me, and I appreciate those of you who do that. A couple of widow ladies I love to pieces. Half a dozen widow ladies that tune in here regularly. One always gives me a bump on Facebook, a like. I appreciate you for that very much. And a couple others that wouldn't let me change the closing music. Now, this is the point I wanted to make. Mr. Armstrong died in January of 1986. And this program, which is not really some people got in there, they met at their kitchen table, and then they decided to accuse me of having a copycat or counterfeit program of Mr. Armstrong. Well, look, this program is done in honor of Mr. Armstrong, and it espouses many of the things that I was able to learn at Ambassador College as a daily student of Mr. Armstrong back in the early 70s. And we tie in the current day's news, with video, which is different than what Mr. Armstrong did, but based on what Mr. Armstrong did. And yes, it's an extension of what he did, but it's using current day's news along with it, which many of you told me you appreciate. I'm thankful to hear that. It started out to just be a program for people in the local area where Mr. Collins, who was the original host, started, when one of the brethren came over and talked about something in the current day's news, and then jumped all over Mr. Collins and me for not knowing what he was talking about that day. He said, you guys have been watching too many Bonanza and Western movies all day long. Mr. Collins had just gotten out of the hospital, and the doctor told me to make sure he watched what he wanted to watch, things that would make him laugh and happy. It helped turn around his cancer, along with God's intervention. But when the man went home, Mr. Collins said, yeah, he's right. You know, we're watching too many Westerns, and we're not paying attention to the news. And Jesus Christ told us in Luke 21:36 to watch and pray always. And the things he was saying, watch, was he was in the very chapter, Luke 21, where he is saying this, he was saying, watch the events I was just talking about, the first 4 seals, false religion, wars, rumors of wars, which is big in the news now, famines, which often happen after wars, you know, and refugees have problems eating a lot of times, and sometimes big famine, and also disease epidemics cause that, which part of the 4th seal, and just part of the 4th seal, there's a big part of the 4th seal, with which is depicted by a pale horse who has a rider on it named Death. Big part, 1/3 of the tribes of Israel are predicted to die from that horse, and the 3rd seal horse, the black horse famine, even in the United States, even in the UK, even in Canada, if we continue to not obey our Creator. Another third will die from that second horse, the red horse, war, by the sword. Another third will be taken captive, and then many of those taken captive will die except for the few hairs that the prophet still had in his shirt tail, and about 10% will be left alive to continue on over into the millennium, the world tomorrow after Jesus Christ returns. Now, I'm giving you some highlights. Some of you people who watch the program know exactly what I'm talking about. Hopefully what I'm just said is a good refresher for you. Say, yeah, that's what's supposed to happen. That is what will happen unless the people of this nation, of the UK, of Canada, of all the other tribes around the world. France, you're in there too, especially you with what's happening yesterday. We'll comment on the analysis of the beginning of Jacob's trouble related to what happened in France yesterday. I'll talk about that, which I finally actually do get into the news stories. But here's what I wanted to tell you related to what we're doing here, and especially with our opening and our closing. Initially, we used some music that was kind of like, I think it was the song Majesty, related to God and His great majesty and all. And then after Mr. Collins died, I switched it over to not exactly the same, but a version that I found of the opening music that, now Mr. Armstrong changed his opening music later, 3 or 4 or 5 years before he died. He changed to a different piece of music. But we were using a theme that in about 1990, the BBC started using. Now, Mr. Armstrong had been using it for, how long? For some 40 years or more before that time. It was available through a Hollywood production piece. It was actually written by a man in London, in England, and his production company. And Ski Sunday picked it up for their opening theme in 1990. So many people in Europe are familiar with our opening theme as, hey, that's the Ski Sunday opening theme. Well, that's not the name of the music, but that's what many people call it now, Ski Sunday, because that BBC program picked it up and used it. Well, I think it makes a good introduction for a news program. I got a little different version of it that's nice and clean, and we're opening with that. So, okay, we're copycat. But, yeah, we are an extension and a continuation in a way of what Mr. Armstrong was doing, but without, in his honor, and with it keeping the current day's news involved with it. Now, the closing music is the closing music Mr. Armstrong used for better than 50 years. He never changed that. And I started to change that. I had a composer writing some music for me. I mentioned that to couple of widows who watched the program and said, hey, I may be changing the closing music. How do you like the idea behind these pieces of music, and these compositions the guy's working on? Whoa, did I get a wham back? Don't you dare change that music. I thought, well, wait a minute, mine is not exactly Mr. Armstrong's program. Don't you dare change that music. We like what you're doing, we want you to keep that music in there. So I got on my knees, I prayed about that, and I said, dear Lord, I know from past experience, if a man troubles a widow and she cries out to the eternal against that man, you take the side of that widow. Oh yeah, God has some discretion, some prejudice even, on behalf of widows. Men, you're wise not to make a widow lady cry before the eternal. You better bend over backwards before you do that. I'm just giving you a piece of experience and some wisdom from God's Word. You check it out. Don't you dare cause a widow to be grieved. And you better be very, very careful of that, because God will back up that widow, especially if you have made her cry. And some people who operate from their kitchen table really would be wise to take heed of that, because I've seen some people get on the internet and really trouble widows. when they should back off and even listen to those widows. So listen, we're not changing the closing music. I may have it updated and refreshed and recomposed, but it'll be the same music. I've already made some contractual arrangements for that with some people in Europe who write and compose beautiful music with orchestras. But it'll be the same. You won't notice any difference other than it'll just sound a little fresher. You know, a little tiny bit rearranged, but a fresh, reorchestrated thing of it. So anyway, all right. Now with that, we're going to talk about in a moment the 81st anniversary and what happened in France. But let's get to this news story about the heat wave and how God has prophesied heat so that even the cattle will cry out. I'll cover those scriptures probably on the weekend, on Sabbath day. Those that tune in with me on the weekend, a different program where I really get into church-related things, and we play recordings of Mr. Armstrong's sermons. I'm starting to take excerpts out of his sermons, and probably even next week, maybe even as early as Sunday night, I'll take a 1-minute excerpt and start to play Mr. Armstrong, put him on the screen here, and let him say some things that relate to the stories we're covering. So these are some plans and things where we're going. Maybe my little diversion at the beginning of tonight's program will be of interest to some of you. But listen, let's cover this first story out of the bushfires that are happening in Australia, and the fact that these fellows are confident they can contain them. Fellows, let me tell you, that's going to depend on the mercy of God. And maybe he's going to grant you some for now and just give you a little warning that maybe some of your people over there need to be more hearty about obeying our Creator. Or you'll see other things happen in the future that represent the curses that you bring on yourself when you fail to obey God and heed His word as He provides us in Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28. In this story, more than 100 people have needed hospital treatment, and at least 38 homes have been destroyed. Ben Wilson is a volunteer firefighter who has been tracking the blazes. He spoke to the BBC about the experiences and shared some dramatic video of the fires that he filmed.
There was quite a few moments where you're looking at the job and wondering just how we're going to tackle it, because it was just such a big, uncontrolled fire. But we had a well-experienced crew with us at that point in time when I was videoing, and we made the correct judgment call and had a lot of skill behind us to be able to operate and really just extinguish that house and be able to protect as much as possible.
So, Ben, when you say you made the correct judgment call, what does that mean? Does that mean what kind of techniques you employ, what equipment you use?
I think it's a combination of all three, but when it comes to a job like that, you need to be able to make a call to not put yourself, obviously, in jeopardy. So the number one thing that we're going to protect is ourselves and other lives. So we made the decision that we had the appropriate skills and equipment on us to be able to save that house without putting ourselves at any due risk.
Now, Ben, from your video, it shows just how close you get to these fires. The firefighters' authorities are saying they are confident that they can bring these under control. Are you confident too?
Absolutely. We had quite a bit of rain come in yesterday, which was a huge relief for all the crews throughout CFS and MFS. We had some new amount of rain that's just coming through at the moment, so the fires have, I think, been almost 100% controlled at this point.
Okay, friends, and I mentioned to you in the opening how thousands of Syrian refugees are enjoying the snow as they spend their fourth winter in tents in Lebanon as heavy snow continues to fall in the area. They're having a moment of enjoyment from it. As you'll see in this video, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has said it is currently providing emergency assistance to over 660,000 people in the camps. Reporting from a camp in Bekaa Valley, East Lebanon, The BBC's Paul Wood said many refugees did not have adequate clothing for the freezing weather.
This is what Lebanon's permanent refugee crisis looks like. There are kids running around dressed more for summer than winter, some of them with flip-flops in this freezing temperature. This is now the fourth winter of the Syrian war, the fourth winter that refugees here in Lebanon have been living under canvas in these atrocious conditions. And getting used to it doesn't make it any easier. In fact, the UN aid agency, the UNHCR, says it's providing emergency winter assistance to no less than 660,000 people.
And, okay, friends, going on to the story out of France. The partner of Stéphane Charbonnier, the editor of Charlie Hebdo, who was killed, or for those of you in England, Charlie Hebdo, who was killed in Wednesday's attack, his partner has paid an emotional tribute to him. Jeanette Bougrad, a former minister in François Fillon's government, told French television station TF1 that the massacre could have been prevented.
Mon amour, je l'appelais comme ça, voilà. Et j'ai pas perdu Charlie Hebdo, j'ai perdu l'être aimé.
I have not lost Charlie Hebdo. I have lost the man I loved. I'm not here speaking as the ex-secretary of François Fillon, but as the companion of a man murdered by barbarous people. The Republic was guilty, and Philippe knows. He had the guts to publish the cartoons of Mohammed. The attackers were systematically protected by the police. There were hate messages, and no one stood up to defend them. That is the reality. The massacre could have been avoided, and we did not do that. I loved him, and I admired him before falling in love with him because he was defiant. That's the way he was. He felt life was not worth a great deal if you did not defend an ideal. Do you know people who are capable of dying for their views? No, because they have just died. They have just been murdered.
And friends, that big massacre occurred on the 81st anniversary of the beginning of the World Tomorrow radio broadcast in 1934 on January 7. Now, there are three items of interest that someone emailed to me, and they wanted to keep their name anonymous. That's fine, but I'm going to say thank you anyway, and I think these factors are very interesting. I want to go over them with you. The World Tomorrow broadcast by Herbert W. Armstrong, the first of three major things related to yesterday's attack in France, relate to this. Number one, Mr. Armstrong repeatedly warned on this program, on the World Tomorrow radio program, and his television program, of the coming time of Jacob's trouble. Now, if Jacob's descendants did not repent before the Almighty, the attack on Charlie Hebdo magazine is seen by France as an attack on the French nation. Let me back up and say those things again. Now, Mr. Armstrong repeatedly warned on the World Tomorrow program of the coming time of Jacob's trouble if Jacob's descendants did not repent before the Almighty. And friends, man is going from bad to worse. I mean, what he was doing that man should have repented of, instead of repenting, as I said, he's gone from bad to worse. Now, in these latter days, we're seeing incredible things that who could have guessed the level of perversion men would be going to with so-called same-sex marriages, as many of my friends have said, Steve, that's not a marriage before God's eyes at all. That's just formalizing some kind of perverted relationship. The attack on Charlie Hebdo magazine is seen by France as an attack on the French nation. The majority of the inhabitants are descended from Reuben, Jacob's firstborn son. Jacob had 12 sons. 12 people were assassinated in yesterday's attack. Are they symbolic of other attacks to follow on the other descendants of Jacob? My friend in his email to me asked. Number 2, the second significant, relevant thing about yesterday's attack related to it occurring on the 81st anniversary of the broadcast of Mr. Armstrong, 81st being 9 times 9. If the article that I'm going to mention to you in a moment is correct about this statement, Yemen was the home of the Sabeans, biblical Sheba, a trading state that flourished for over 1,000 years and probably also included parts of modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. If so, then the Hebrew Bible's book of Job, believed to be the oldest in the Bible, describes the first act of terrorism and tribulation in collaboration with Satan against righteous Job as coming from the same people who attacked France yesterday on the World Tomorrow broadcast, 81st anniversary since its beginning on January 7, 1934. In Job 1, verse 13, let me pull that up on the screen for you. Job chapter 1 and verse 13. God says through Job, "And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house." And verse 14, "And there came," let's see, what happened? All right, they popped up out of order. Here's verse 14. "And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the asses feeding beside them." And verse 15, "And the Sabeans fell on them and took them away." Now maybe some of you haven't noticed that before, or had no reason to equate the significance of who the Sabeans are before yesterday's attack. "And the Sabeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And I only, just one messenger only, am escaped alone to tell you." And so, friends, number 3, the third thing significant to yesterday's attack, Assyria's leader, Angela Merkel, had a 5-hour meeting yesterday with Ephraim's leader, David Cameron. This occurring yesterday, January 7, 2015, 81 years since the beginning of the World Tomorrow program on January 7, 1934. She declined to comment about whether she would support or oppose any of the changes being sought by Mr. Cameron. The Prime Minister earlier accompanied Mrs. Merkel to an exhibition on the history of Germany at the British Museum. The 5-hour visit one of a number of Mrs. Merkel is making to world leaders as part of Germany's year-long presidency of the G7 group of nations. The presidency that she holds is likely to be her last to the UK before May's general election. And friends, I've got a video with David Cameron from yesterday's meeting in which he says, I can fix the EU problem. We'll come back to this report after we hear Mr. Cameron say that in this video.
I don't think that the right answer is for Britain to leave the EU. I think the right answer is for EU reform and then a referendum. And I've set out very clearly the changes in terms of immigration and welfare that need to take place. And they don't, I think, break the principle that there should be free movement, because, of course, many British people benefit from moving inside the European Union to live and work in other countries. But the very clear things I've set out is saying that if you come here, you should not be eligible for unemployment benefit. If you come, then if you haven't found a job in 6 months, you need to return to your country of origin. If you haven't paid into the system for 4 years, you can't start to get out of the system. And if your family and your children are back at home in another European country, you shouldn't be getting child benefit here in Britain. Those are, 4 of the welfare and immigration steps I've set out. They do require some changes in Europe, but I think they are sensible, they're practical. I'm enjoying talking to European colleagues about them, and I think that is the way to control the abuse of free movement inside the European Union. That is the outcome I seek. I've always said that if it isn't possible to achieve these things, I rule nothing out, but I'm very clear about what I want to achieve: a reform within the EU, a referendum in which Britain decides to stay in a reformed European Union. And I've set out very clearly what that requires. As for those people who argue from now it's time to leave the European Union, it's for them to answer your question about what that means. I think actually the answers they give are often very contradictory with respect to the points you make about Switzerland or what you could say about Norway. But that's for them to make that argument. That's not my argument. My argument is stay in the European Union, have this renegotiation, hold the referendum, the British people decide.
Okay, friends, did you notice while Mr. Cameron was speaking, Mrs. Merkel's facial expressions there? In fact, I think the freeze frame is on a very appropriate expression ending that video that shows her enthusiasm for what Mr. Cameron was saying about all the reform he wants to have made within Europe. Friends, I hope I believe I'm saying enthusiasm with tongue in cheek. That's obviously not an expression of enthusiasm you see on the face of Mrs. Merkel there. Her meeting yesterday on January 7, 2015 may prove to be of importance in Britain's prophesied future. Let me show you some slides that we have related to the email that my friend sent to me, that he enclosed these pictures in the email. This photograph shows the national emblem of Yemen. And Yemen are the people related to the Sabeans mentioned in Job, chapter 1, verse 15 that I was reading to you a moment ago. Then the capture on this next picture. This shows the distribution of ethno-religious groups and key tribal areas. I don't know how well you can see this. It's probably kind of small. And so let's go on to some of the other photographs he sent. This one shows the Ottoman Grand Vizier and Wali of Yemen, Ahmed Muhtar Pasha. And then this photograph shows Sanaa's city, Sanaa city center in Yemen. And then this last photograph here that my friend sent along shows a typical Yemen house. And these are images of Yemen from where terrorists who attacked Charlie Hebdo magazine are said to have originated. And then, friends, I've got another article. I'm just going to read you some excerpts from the Council on Foreign Affairs. They say the Charlie Hebdo attack and the future of Al-Qaeda is how they titled this report from today's news. The death toll may still rise. 12 were killed yesterday. this news story saying the death toll may still rise. There was a report earlier today of how the police converged on a place where the two attackers from yesterday held up a gas station. And thankfully the clerk was left alive, but they stole money and food and gas. Now, yesterday's attack coincided with an editorial meeting at the Charlie Hebdo newspaper, magazine, with key staffers assembled at that meeting. According to eyewitness reports, the perpetrators forced their way into a back office, calling out the names of the editor and cartoonist before shooting them. The assassins, presumed to be Al-Qaeda members, escaped. The death toll makes this week's attack the most significant on French soil since the Nazi occupation, a huge milestone in Al-Qaeda's campaign against the West, this article is pointing out. Their attack, it's part of a long line of plots to kill media figures for their symbolic value in the West as paragons of free speech, and to some Muslims as examples of the evil of secularism. For the terrorist, the staff of Hebdo were particularly appealing targets, since the Hebdo magazine was one of the few European papers that, in the wake of the 2009 Danish cartoon episode, the French magazine continued to publish irascible cartoons of Muhammad, ridiculing the pieties of extremist Islamists. In fact, the paper's editorial office had already been firebombed in 2011 after it published a special Muhammad issue ostensibly featuring the Muslim prophet as guest editor. Ongoing threats to the paper were public and well known. The French line on the attack is that it was a unique incident carried out by professional terrorists assumed to have learned their skills in Syria. The three men, identified by the French police as the gunmen, are the stuff of French nightmares, this article says. All three spoke in French, and exiting the scene of their crime, they told bystanders to tell the media that they came from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. One member of the cell, Hamid Murad, is just 18 years old and is said to have attended high school in the northern city of Reims. The other two are brothers, Saeed Kouachi, who is 34 years old, and Sharif Kouachi, who is 32. The Kouachi brothers would have been well known to the French police. Sharif was arrested in January 2005 and convicted 3 years later in connection with a recruitment ring that planned to send French residents to fight for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. At the time, Sharif thanked the police for preventing him from going to Iraq, but his regrets may not have been sincere. In May 2010, he was arrested again in connection with a plot to free two well-known French-Algerian jihadists. And those two were perpetrators that he wanted to help free, were perpetrators of the 1995 Paris metro bombings. And then, friends, another report I've been reading from, and I've got a few excerpts I want to share with you before we close tonight's edition of Nightcast. This one is from an article where this section of the article is entitled Paris Attack Underscores a Deeper Malaise. This is from a special reporting agency, Stratford, where they say yesterday's deadly attack against a French satirical publication has the potential to upset relations between European states and their Muslim citizenries. The strategic intent behind such attacks is precisely to sow this kind of crisis, as well as to influence French policy and recruit more jihadists. Even though Islamist extremism is at its core an intra-Muslim conflict, such incidents will draw in non-Muslims, exacerbating matters. 3 suspected Islamist militants attacked the Paris office of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo with high-powered assault rifles, killing 12 people. Among the dead are the editor and the cartoonist Stéphane Charbonnier, who was on a hit list appearing in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's Inspire magazine for, quote, insulting the Prophet Muhammad. Eyewitnesses said they heard the attackers shouting, "We have avenged the Prophet Muhammad," and chanting, "God is great," in Arabic. This is the third such attack in a Western country in less than 3 months. The Paris incident involves perpetrators who displayed sophisticated small arms and small unit training. Whether or not these attacks are the handiwork of self-motivated grassroots jihadists and cells, or of individuals tied to international jihadist entities, such incidents aggravate tense relations between the Western and Muslim worlds. There is all the more significant. This is all the more significant in Europe, where states are experiencing the rise of right-wing nationalism, and Muslim communities have long experienced disaffection. The jihadist objective is to get the states to crack down harder on Muslim communities in order to further their narrative that the West is waging war on Islam and Muslims. While Western states go to great lengths to demonstrate that no such clash of civilizations is occurring, right-wing forces engage in rhetoric that reinforces these fears among many common Muslims across the world. More important, there is a long-standing conflict of values, particularly freedom of expression, which is cherished in the West but seen by many Muslims as a license for sacrilege. Though the vast majority of Muslims will not engage in violence in response to speech deemed as blasphemous, there are many who will. And it only takes a few. I mean, look, these 3 guys yesterday, they thought there were 2, and then they found out there's a third one involved. They did a lot of damage. Just the 3 of them. 2 gunmen and the third fellow with them. In Pakistan, the blasphemy law has been a subject of huge controversy. Many Pakistani citizens have been murdered by their fellow countrymen for speech or behavior deemed objectionable. At the root of this problem is the extreme discomfort many Muslims have with free expression. Although this attitude is not universal, the person of the Prophet is all the more sensitive because the traditional view is that he cannot be depicted pictorially, let alone in a satirical manner. Now, the other report pointed out the same thing as this one that I'm reading some excerpts to you from related to today's current news events, yesterday, from yesterday. It's still a current thing because they're anticipating more people to be killed from in the same vein. Ultimately, this is an intra-Muslim struggle for power and control wrapped in a debate over what it means to be a Muslim in today's world and what the boundaries of justifiable action are. You know, friends, I'm comment right there. You know, the kind of actions you just seen are totally contrary to what the God of heaven, through his word, Jesus Christ, tells us to love our neighbor and to give drink to an enemy, not to murderously kill them. Back to the article. I'll close up with this. Defining these factors defining those factors is one tool that can be used to gain power. Attacks against the West and its interest meant to force Westerners to pull out of Muslim lands or to attack Muslims and enforce the jihadist narrative are another. This issue undermines efforts by moderate and progressive Muslims to advance the notion of freedoms based on an Islamic ethos. You know, friends, the very definition of a Muslim is one who practices the Islam religion. The Islam religion is based on the Quran, a book written roughly generally around 600 A.D. with the aid of the Catholic Church, who funded some generals in connection with the writing of that book and putting together of that Muslim religion in about 600 A.D. and promoting the Prophet Muhammad and tying Madonna in with Mary, so that there's kind of a connection between Muslim Madonna and mother, wife of Muhammad, and Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ. And it went awry on the Catholic Church because as they funded these generals, the deal was once they killed all the professing Christians and the Jews keeping the Sabbath in Jerusalem, Jerusalem was to be handed over to the Vatican. But and this is revealed by a former Jesuit who worked in the Vatican and in the secret enclaves. He had access to all those papers, and he revealed those recently. You can Google that and read his stories. And it backfired. The generals were so successful, they decided, hey, we're not giving you Jerusalem. We're going to build a dome of the rock. We're going to build a dome over the rock there and make that a second big deal. And they laid the claim that instead of Isaac, Ishmael was taken up. You know, Abraham is the father of the Ishmaelites, who are the Arab people, who are the large practice, which is by and large the majority of Muslims are Arab people, descendants of Ishmael, who was the son of Abraham by Sarah's handmaid Hagar, Egyptian handmaid Hagar. So the Ishmaelites are the cousins or stepbrother of Isaac. And they're the stepbrother of Isaac. They're the cousins of all the rest of the descendants of Isaac, of Jacob's kids, 12 sons. And, you know, then they have their 12 divisions and 12 chiefs also through Ishmael. And God promised there'd be a thorn in the side of their brethren. And their brethren includes their stepbrothers and cousins, who are the descendants of Isaac and Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And Israel doesn't just include the people, the Jews of the Middle East. It includes all of the tribes of Israel who were identified where they would be in the last days, and these are the last days, and we know where they are. Reuben is in France, Joseph is in the United States and the UK and other areas, Canada even, that are descendants of Manasseh and Ephraim, who take the name of Joseph and stand in his shoes. As you know, they're half-tribes of the tribe of Joseph, one of the 12 sons. And the other tribes, we know where they are. Once in a while, I put a slide up on the screen to show you that here. And but let me read you another sentence or two from this This article I was just reading, friends, we're just going to take some excerpts of current day's news, which it's the only way I can do this, but the jihadist enterprise deliberately targets non-Muslims, in particular the West, in part as a means to gain ground within the Muslim milieu. This strategy also sucks the Western world into what is essentially a Muslim civil war in order to tackle the secular threats posed by Islamist militant actors. However, the opinions of many experts is that Western involvement in this internal debate will not help defeat extremism or ease relations between Muslims and the West. The experts say that the end of jihadism will come only when Muslims defeat their own deviance on the ideological battleground. But the real truth, friends, is that the end of jihadism and all forms of what might be called government today, the governments of this world, will not come to an end until Jesus Christ returns to restore the kingdom of God upon this earth, a kingdom that will replace all governments, bar none. More about that this weekend on the Sabbath.tv channel. That's it for this Thursday night edition of Nightcast, friends. We don't do a report on Friday night or Saturday. God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll be back with our next Nightcast, the day's current news related to the Bible and prophecy, Sunday evening. Until next time, thanks for joining me, friends. This is your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying so long and good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.